Okay, so the two chapters, this is a good, pretty long section. They're called Token and Go Back to Your Country. So I've broken down each individual chapter. I've made some notes about what I think you need to focus on. And if you have any other questions, this is the time, or any points you want to make, I'll add these to the notes before I post them on my Willow. Okay, so this chapter is about token, and when we talk about the term token, we're talking about the idea that when someone says you're a token, you're saying that you are the singular individual within a room full of people that are different from you. So she talks about being like the only black person maybe in a class, or maybe the only black person being on a bus in London, or the only black person being in a restaurant or at a club or event or a party, or that there are very few of them. And the token is that this is the one person who's there supposed to represent the entire group of people. So she talks about this tokenism that she experiences in university. And this is really tied to the idea what she says that the idea of being hyper visible in the world. So her argument is, and this also refers back to the video I showed you when she had an interview on TVO. She talks about the fact that blacks are always seen and judged as individuals. So when a black person's in an event or in a situation, they're noticed right away, right? They're seen, they're identified, and their actions are judged upon them, and how they act, how they react, are based upon stereotypes that society has developed for people of color, specifically for black people. So there's this heightened individualism. So uh, she might see it as, and people of color, black people might see it as walking into a store and being watched, right? Um, Walking into a classroom and being, when they talk about race, everyone turns around. Okay, so she says that you're paid attention as an individual, right? If you're in groups, that attention is magnified because then that group action becomes a threat. We have to manage or look at those groups of black people who might be doing things, and because there are negative stereotypes towards black people, this is being violent or disruptive or giving criminal behavior, that group is then hyper focused upon and hyper managed and hyper distraught. And in those situations, uh, blacks could find themselves in situations where they feel that their lives are in danger or there's a threat, right? So she says that basically, so that some black people will shun others to avoid the knowledge for survival. And she talks about the fact there's a scene where she's on the bus and she sees a black person, she tries to make eye contact, but she doesn't. And then actually does that. She goes through a series of stories to sort of as sort of an example to sort of understand why that person chose to not make eye contact. And her argument is that they don't make eye contact because if they do, people assume that they're a group and then they'll be further noticed, further managed, and that could put their lives in jeopardy. Okay? Um, and again, if you look at the book, she makes a good point. She talks about the fact that a couple of years ago, and I remember this in Toronto, there was an event called Afrofest. And so, like any events that happen in the summer, it's a celebration of African culture, food, music, dance, a whole lot. And there was a point where it was targeted and it was shut down, and its license was being taken away because people complained about noise. Now, some argue that I don't understand that there are many events that happen in Toronto. Why is it being targeted about noise? Well, we find out later that that event, there were 6 people who complained about the noise, and they pulled their ticket, they pulled their permit, and people argue that why are you um, moving a ticket to an Africa event called Africaville, or sorry, Afrofest, because of 6 complaints, when there are other events that have been loved, just as loved, and there have been many more complaints and you've done nothing. So that's the idea that if you see a group of black people doing something together, they become hyper focused, their actions are judged on a more severe basis, and therefore um, you they'll be targeted. That targeted can be just the removal of events like Afrofest, but it also could be someone's life being taken because therefore you send police in because you want to monitor them, and then escalates and escalates and escalates in situations that come back. She talks about this liberating the feeling of being able to exist without being viewed and judged. And she talks about her friend Malcolm, and then when Malcolm and Taz all get together. Now, Taz is a woman of South Asian descent. Malcolm is black, but she talks about the fact that they can all act and say and behave in the way they want without fear of judgment, that they don't feel that someone's watching them, and therefore they have to be hypersensitive and and be aware of that thing. She deals with being a token black person in both academic and social life, right? So when she talks about social life, it's about tokenism, sometimes being at a party and then someone will say, hey, I know another black person, you will probably like them. There's that kind of tokenism, right? But she also talks about the fact that tokenism can exist within other cultures, non-white cultures, so South Asians. And later on, we'll talk about in our notes, we'll talk about the idea of how there is this divide within Black and Brown communities. I mean, Black and Brown communities. I'm talking about South Asians, so people who would be Indian or from Pakistan, from that region of Asia, and how there is a divide. While people may look at both groups and say, "Oh, you both have brown skin, you both have a similar experience." She talks about the fact that it's not a similar experience, and there are differences that 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 need to be addressed. That even with that community, blacks are sort of separated again. So she talks about going to a party, meeting a South Asian man, and it seems to be going great until he says, "I can't believe I'm dating a black girl." You know, they say when you go black, never go back, and she gets totally like, "I can't believe this." That her, the man at the party who after the dance wasn't dancing with her, but it was a novelty of, "Oh, look, I've got a black girlfriend now. I'll show all my South Asian friends that I'm black." So she talks about that sort of tokenism, and I've sometimes put pages beside them, so you can go look at what I've talked about and maybe go review it. Some things I'll talk about today, but I won't be able to go through everything. But these are just some of the things you can always go back to look at. She also discusses the academic side of this, when she discusses being policed by white students for the assumption that she would be lazy and privileged not to have to deal with systemic racism and bias while in classes, right? So you want you to view the story of Megan. She talks about the story of a student named Megan in the classroom who she says she calls her a typical white London girl. And she says basically it's the idea that she can exist in a world of privilege where her actions and judgments aren't being monitored by other people. She talks about this class specifically because she says she has a black professor, and there's situations where she in the class one day, she's there and she's not feeling well, she misses class, and then but her friend tells her to come to a party, and then Megan sees her at a party and says, "Hey, you're here. You're supposed to be in class." She goes, I wasn't feeling that great. And then Megan says, "Don't worry, I won't tell anybody." But the next day, Megan goes and tells the professor, who then embarrasses her. And she talks about the fact that she feels angered at the fact that Megan betrayed her. That he said it's typical. What she says it's a typical thing where Megan or people like Megan will claim to be super friendly and say girl and sister and all that stuff, but turn around and police them because of their assumption that she's black, she's lazy and therefore needs to be monitored. Her black professor doesn't really say anything directly, but she says that she gets the information that the professor says you need to be says without saying words, you should be smarter than this. I want you to succeed, but I'm not going to treat you differently. And then later on, they talk about a group project they have where she's assigned the least intensive part of the project because the assumption is that, well, she can't handle the work. And then Megan goes missing, and Megan starts coming to classes, and Megan starts going to parties, and Megan's on Facebook taking selfies. And then when she goes and tells on Megan to a professor, the professor goes, "Oh, I know Megan's doing that, and I'm making her give everyone individual marks." And then Megan comes to class and says something sweet about, I like to, it's so nice to know people of different cultures and races. And when she gets a crappy mark, she gets upset. But part of the story is she wants to illustrate that as a black person, even in classrooms, you have to deal with the systemic racism, that you are monitored for your behavior while others can do what they want and no one goes and tells the professor and no one feels the need to do so. So again, attorney does tell on Megan, but specifically because she's frustrated at the fact that in a group project, Megan's not showing up, and then she'll have to either do Megan's work or take a lesson mark, right? Where at this other situation, Megan claims to be friends, claims to be an ally, but then tells on her, not because she thinks that it's going to affect her mark, but the idea is that, well, that black person's doing something wrong, so I have to tell on them. For lack of a better term, you guys heard the word Karen? When I heard that someone's been called a Karen, you know what the term means? Right. So it's that kind of thing where, someone, I'm going to tell on you because you're breaking the rules. Okay. Why are you telling on me specifically, right? So it's that kind of attitude she talks about. The two things she has to deal with in personal life and academic life. And again, this is, again, the sort of meta narrative that goes on is that these things add up. These instances add up. These instances lead to things like depression, lead to things like issues with mental health, because it's a daily situation where she's got to think about how to respond to all these situations while in class, while in life, while just even riding a bus where she's got to see a black person in there. And again, part of the bus story that she says when she saw a black person is that if she sits beside her, is she identifying another black woman for danger? Because when she's on the bus, seems like a black woman, another woman looks over and says, "Is that your sister? Are you related?" Right? Go Back to Your Country is a little longer, and it deals with lots of things. Basically, it deals with two specific issues here. I think it's about her being biracial and the black and brown divide. So her mother is of Pakistani background. Her father, who was in her life, is a Jamaican background. So her physical appearance would be traditionally what you would say as looks like a black woman, but she has been raised in a Pakistani household, has been raised with South Asian culture and food and values and movies, but she doesn't look like them, right? And the book deals with the fact that she has to deal with the reality of her appearance and how that's perceived by the outside world, right? So lots of people of biracial background deal with this. I have two daughters of biracial background, and they deal with this. I've had a friend who has a daughter of biracial background and deal with this, and discussed with the mother. The mother said, in their household, they don't say the daughters are black or white; they are biracial. That's it, right? And I'm saying, okay, that's fine, that's great. That's how you want to divide your fears. That's cool. But you have other people who will take the other opposite spectrum. Halle Berry is an actress, is a biracial woman, but says her mom, who raised her was white, said, "Look, you look black, so people are going to treat you as a black person. Therefore, me telling you that you're biracial does not help you navigate the world." So she has to deal with this idea that while she has this rich South Asian culture and heritage that she belongs to, she's raised in, people still perceive her as black, right? Um, Also, just like the discussion of issues of the shade of skin color and what does it mean to be in the South Asian community. So in South Asian communities, and this also happens in the Black community, that the darker your skin is, the less value you have in society. And because South Asians can be as light as Europeans and as dark as me, uh, those divides come up. And she feels this divide because she, again, looks more African or Black than South Asian, right? That if she goes to events, people look at her differently because of what are you doing here? You don't look like us. So she has to deal with this divide within the community and the fact that because South Asians are a little lighter, they may be treated more fairly. If you look at any system of slavery in North America, even the French slavery at its height, in France there are 140 over 140 definitions of black, and it's from being 100% black to 1/64th black, right? In America, there was the 160 rule: if you have one drop of black blood, you are technically black. So it's this idea that the closer you are to whiteness, or looking whiteness, the more privileges you have, right? And because she does not have that in this world that she grows up in, she gets a double whammy. She walks out into the outside world. She's a black woman, therefore she's treated not as fairly as other women. She goes home to her South Asian community because she's a darker skinned woman. She is still looked down upon, and that's sort of the double thing she struggles with, which leads to eventually her just claiming and accepting and sort of saying to herself that she is a black woman, right? Not that she's rejecting her Pakistani heritage or South Asian heritage, but her identity is, she defines herself as black because she says, this is how the world perceives me, this is how I see myself, and I need to move in that space. Right, so there's the issues of identity and how does one identify themselves as racially. Now, again, this is different than, let's say, there was a couple years ago, there's another woman who did it. A woman called Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman who said, well, I feel black and I feel culturally black and I do this as black. And there was a lot of pushback from the black community because it was like, well, that's nice, you feel black and that you identify as black. You are a white woman, and if you decide to be a white woman, you can snap and choose. But as a black person, a black person, I can't do that. And there were all issues, the fact that she was had a job at the NAACP, and people were saying, that job should go to a black person of color to represent, to speak to those issues. For Rachel Dolezal, at one time, was identified as a white woman, and therefore, but now says, well, now I'm black because I feel black, right? And again, there's lots of issues there. I'm not a huge fan of that person because, the black experience is more than just what she defines. Because what type of black person are you? Are you from the West Indies? Are you from England? Are you from Africa? Are you from France? Are you from America? Those are all different experiences in the African diaspora. You can't say you're black because you're talking about a specific type of black experience. Neither here nor there. She is who she is, whatever. The other thing she discussed in this chapter is anger towards diversity and white rage. And she identifies it as the idea that as more cultural groups, as London becomes more diverse, there is pushback from those who are there, and the idea that diversity leads to a switch in power. Now, in a society where there's privilege based upon your racism, or your racial background, if there are more people there, there is a fear that your power will go. Now, on some level, that's right? The job you thought you would be guaranteed doesn't mean you'll get it right away. It means that there's more competition, right? So she talks about the fact that there's lots of pushback she experiences, right? She experiences the fact that she went to school during the time where there's a professor named Philippe Rustin who basically was teaching a class that said that black people are the most sexually hypersexualized individuals on the planet, right? Sort of a scale where you had Asians being the smartest people, but sexually less, blacks being not very smart, but sexually thing, and then whites being somewhere in the middle. He was there for many years until he would let go. She talks about the fact that as one of the groups that pushed in, they were pushed back. Western, when the Black Lives Matter movement came to the Western posters have been saying Western Lives Matter, which people said, well, that's not the point. You are mocking what we're struggling for, and you're not getting the point. Again, there's a series of events that happen, and she also documents issues of white supremacy on the campus, right? And she says that, and she makes and I'll share the actual speech. She talks about the fact that when there is this move towards diversity and there's this fear of the lack of the loss of power, that those individuals become more violent, more angry, more offensive out there. She talks about the fact that she gets called the N-word with her friend or walking on the street. She's being told to go back where she comes from, that she's being a citizen. These are things that she says that's the fear that you live with in the community, where a simple crossing can be a situation where it becomes violent, and you could end up in a situation. And the university seems to be doing not much of anything, right? Okay. She talks about in this chapter a competition with the white supremacists, and basically her struggles with that because it's a friend she has, and her friend being married to a guy whose friend of the guy is a white supremacist. And she goes to the wedding and has to deal with his situation that the guy had called her the N-word at the wedding. She had to dance the horror with him at the wedding. And she was going to get into his face about it, but she goes, I could or could not. She was also deals with the fact because, look, I like my friend, but I was afraid that if I didn't go to the wedding, or I said I'm not going because you have your other racist friend going, they would choose the racist friend over her. So at a layer where she says that even in situations like this, I have to be constantly aware that I'm maybe second best in the situation, and I don't have control. And it's something she has concerns or she feels emasculated because she doesn't have the power to, she has to, this is nothing to deal with. Like, again, going to a wedding, you're supposed to have a good time, but she did content with the fact that someone there is overly hostile towards her. But also in the situation, she talks about her friend Angela, where she talks at the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter, and talks about how Angela is a lesbian, and she kind of teaches her how to fight. And she goes, well, seeing her friend teaches her how to throw a punch, right? How to mess someone up. And she talks about the fact that she appreciates that because that individual taught her power and control. That if in a situation that man had gotten too close to her, she knew how to defend herself. Not that she should hit him, but she had the power to. And in that situation, she thanks that person, Angela, because Angela taught her control, right? The ability to not be afraid of the situation, but knowing if you have control over it, then you don't do anything. And she says that I probably wouldn't have gotten to a fight with him because I knew I could handle myself. I know I can. I don't have to be afraid of anything. So if he did, I know how to defend myself. And that power gave me the ability to maintain my control. Okay? And again, the last part of the, well, throughout the trip, she identifies why she's Black. And her family coming to the realization of that her identifying her Blackness has nothing to do with the rejection of her, and that they're having to pivot and switch because they've experienced, again, it's not as if South Asians didn't experience racism, but it was a different form, and they felt it was more based upon them first coming to the country, and now that they are in the country, they're seen as the minority, everything's fine, it shouldn't be this way for you. So, and she talks about her grandfather always showing her stuff about people of Pakistani background, and then him clicking in and, oh, wait a minute, but you're Black. So I should show you authors that are Black women and Black people to inspire you. And then she talks about the fact that it's a switch that our families had to make because of her own issues with her own identity. And again, it's a learning process because she has to deal with all these different layers all at the same time. Okay. Are there any questions about this specific chapter that anyone wants to have, or anything they picked up, anything they don't understand? Okay. All right. And again, I've used terms like white rage and white privilege. The idea is that having power within society and being able to exercise that power is a privilege, right? So Megan is a perfect example of this. Megan cannot be in class, and while she's caught by a professor for missing class, she has the privilege of someone not telling on her because they perceive her as lazy based upon her race, right? Where Eternity talks about in the book that Black students feel the need to do super well because if they don't, they're judged by their behavior. Okay? And like again, I will always make the argument that before Mr. Orangeface took over the office, Barack Obama was president, and he had to be literally perfect. He couldn't make any mistakes, right? He couldn't have said grab a woman by hair or whatever. He couldn't have done any of the gaps that Trump has done because he would be toast, right? He couldn't have a background that Trump has, he would be toast, right? He did do drugs, he had to admit it because in his situation, it is a privilege to have a messed up background and still be able to run. Where he's in a situation where if he's not absolutely perfect as a politician, as a human being, he would not have gotten 8 years. Right? And that's the privilege, right? That's the idea that if you're in a dumb society and you're a dumb culture, you can be fully human and people will accept your faults and things. But if you're not of that culture, any mistake you make is magnified and said, well, that's why we don't let you do these things, right? So it's the fear and the overall thing that she's constantly worried with that Black students deal with when they go to school. And sometimes they rise to the occasion and they overachieve because they have to, or sometimes they retract because it's too much pressure. Any other questions? Okay, I'm just going to do a quick new share and just go over one or two things in the book. So I want to look at one or two quotes. Well, this is one I wanted to go through. This is the one where she's at the party and she meets this South Asian man and she thinks, oh, this is great, he's into me. And this is the thing she deals with. But at night, in the middle of the dance floor, Sunil would put his friends and me together in a huddle and say, I never thought I'd be dating a black girl. He'd say, shaking his beer with everyone like it was a cause for celebration. It's true that once you go black, you never go back. You should try it. And he puts his arm around me, pushing me forward. Can you believe that she's Pakistani and black too? When we got home, we fight about it. It's a compliment. I don't know why you have to get so mad, he said impatiently. I thought only white folks would recognize me, but Sunil and I were both South Asian. We're both from the same culture, yet my brownness was negated by my blackness. He was a reminder of my family back at home. But to him, I was sorry that he could share with his friends about the black girl he once dated. By early October, our phone calls fizzled out and we went our separate ways. She talks about the fact of being tokenized by her person she thought she liked because she was black, but again, she grew up in South Asian culture. Her family's that. So she's like, why are you focusing on my blackness? And I'll read this little part about Megan. Uh, Megan's little tattletale could have affected my academic performance. She had gone out of her way to make sure she read on me, but I wasn't surprised. I knew how white girls operated, smiling in the faces of women of color, acting like our friends and our allies, calling us queen and girl and snapping their fingers, and then turning on us for personal gain, using tears or carefully chosen words disguised as false innocence or concern to plant seeds that they can keep they reap for their own benefit. When Megan missed class or texted or had conversations about her weekend instead of listening to lectures she paid for, that was not my business nor my money. But when her friends skipped class and she took notes for them, when her friends skipped class, she took notes for them. When I skipped class, she took notes for a professor. She was policing me, and she used it as her one-up, as it was her job to report and weed out the lady students who were not devoted, who didn't belong. So she talks about that idea. At the same time, we talk about tokenization, that she's being attacked and policed. Uh, and again, um, used and weaponized for her friend's behavior that pretend to be an ally, but then benefying that from one aspect. I can only think of what happened summer this time with Jessica Maroney and Sasha Exer, who was a social blocker, and she made a statement about people being allies to black people. Jessica only took it personally, and then called her up and threatened her again, and at the same time claiming that I understand because my best friend is Meghan Markle, and that's what she's saying that hey, look, you are attacking me when Sarah Esther didn't say I didn't even mention you in the quote. I was just talking about things in general. So that's another aspect of it. And I'll do over one more quote before. And I'll just go over this one part. The longer I lived in London, the more I became to understand that why that girl on the bridge and that girl on the bus didn't make eye contact. Well, public space is white space. Marks museums, neighborhoods, and restaurants, spaces where middle class values are predominantly accessed by white people. Now my bodies are hyper visible and heavily surveilled in these spaces. If we want to pass through without trouble, we have to appear non-threatening, with the dress, speak, and act in ways that are compatible with others in these spaces. Okay, so okay, I'm not gonna go over that. She mentions in the interview with on TVO, but it's also something she talks about as these are the things that I have to endure and deal with all the time, and therefore it makes sense why um, black folks tend to keep quiet about the issue. And this is one quote she talks about, and it talks about her struggles in her house. My mother and my grandmother were closer to peace, and I was closer to darkness, and darkness was a danger. Darkness was when I ran to the back of the house, playing like the outdoors and playing with kids on the block all day. When I was a bad man who drove into our little, little children into their cars when asking for directions, and when it was the boogeyman under the bed made his move. Without realizing it, I had internalized this like of myself that I couldn't articulate. She talks about the fact that that blackness and that all means something that is negative towards her, and she's got to sort of process that. And even in her own family, uh, she's seen as negative. Okay. Um, and just one little part here I'm going to read, and then we'll just move forward. But in a school full of teens who are also thinking about the nuances of identity, I could start to think my own. Light skin and dark skinned me were emerging, and kids would put is or did DS beside their Facebook name. People wore their ethnicities with pride through their clothing, or expressed it through their multiracial identities in their bios for Facebook pages, calling themselves mixed. The lighter you are, the more attractive, the less conventional your mix, the more desirable. Mixed wasn't a word I liked. And anyway, it was usually reserved for black, white, or white, Asian, biracial people. It was what black kids called me. Everyone else referred to me as black. Brown kids, even though accepting of our shared identity couldn't get past my appearance. Okay, so those are some of the quotes that, again, I pulled from there. The other ones she talks about, we don't have time to go over the other ones that she sort of identifies. You can look them up in the notes that talks about, again, about Rushton, and it talks about her issues here. Maybe read this one last one because it's a good one. How could it be imaginary, the perceived threat to whiteness and the fear of losing privileges and comforts associated with being white be ripped simply because of diversity? When every system has defended and upheld whiteness ferociously for centuries, and yet those who fear whiteness is under attack and then attack people of color in the form of threats, violence, and harassment. Those who defend their right to freedom of speech try to silence others who exercise that same right. These posters reveal the anxiety of what could happen when those of us oppressed by systems of whiteness start to pick up at the cracks of its structure. So you just about the fact that, this is another thing to deal with. She is trying to address the fact that there is this pushback towards diversity, right? Because for years, the system has worked in some people's favor and not. And she's saying that this is the time where people are sort of pushing back, saying it's time for it to change. Okay, are there any questions from the people at home or any questions from people here about what we've kind of talked about?
Nope.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Just